So in this chapter, we're diving into the formal analysis part of art appreciation. Here we take all that we've learned so far. We've identified the elements and principles of design, and we're going to look at some additional identifiers that will help us understand art a little bit better. A formal or critical analysis means we examine an artwork by how those elements and principles are used. In addition to using the elements and principles to dissect an artwork, we also use representation and style. So when we're talking about the types of art, we're basically talking about three categories: representation and abstraction, idealization, and a non-representational or non-objective art. So representational and abstraction art, representation is it's a pretty broad category that refers to how we see the world. Representational work looks like some part of the world as we know it, and it looks exactly as we know it. Now, abstraction departs from reality. Abstraction can take liberties such as changing the form or the color of an object. We can still identify the object for the most part, but it isn't trying to look real. And here are two examples of representational art and abstracted art. So we have on the left, we have a painting that really looks like it could be a photograph instead. So we know that that is exactly what those kinds of cows look like. Now, the one on the right isn't. I've never seen a yellow cow. I think the rhyme was a purple cow, but in this case, they've taken liberties and changed up the color and changed up the way the cow is acting. Here again, we have examples. On the left, we have a representational piece of art, looks real. On the right, we have an abstracted. They're still musicians, they're still playing instruments, but in two completely different styles. Idealism in art encourages imagination, tends to make a mental conception of something. The artist treats the subject of the artwork with a mindset of perfection rather than being completely realistic. We've all heard the talk about the ideal man or the ideal woman and what they should look like, and we also know that there's no such thing. The Egyptian pharaohs were thought to be like gods, so they were always portrayed with the perfect body shape, perfect face, completely flawless. Here are some examples of how idealization has translated through art. Khafra Enthroned on the far left is a 4th dynasty Egyptian sculpture from about 2570 BC. Now, this isn't what he actually looked like, but it is an idealized representation. And we talked about the materials that artwork is made out of and how that can affect its value. Well, this stone was actually floated on the Nile for 400 miles to get where they needed it to be. So the use of this stone in itself indicated that he was a very important and powerful person. Now, the seated pose is very rigid, showing him with a very idealized physique. The sculpture is very symmetrical, indicating order and control. The headdress and beard are perfect as a pharaoh who is thought to be godlike should be. And the blocky statue ensures that over time, no part of the figure could be broken off. Now, the Kairos was an early Greek figure of a young male. You can notice the Egyptian influence and the reliance on geometric shapes to define the contours of the body. As we progress, we see the figures becoming more realistic with more accurate body proportions. The third one, I'm sorry, is really the beginning of the classical Greek style. It is less rigid, the beginning of contrapposto, which is an asymmetric pose. And then the one on the far right uses a contrapposto pose, and the classical realism that the Greeks were known for. So you can see how the representation of people changed throughout the years. So now we are to non-representational or non-objective art. Abstraction served to streamline or de-emphasize certain real-world references. Ultimately, though, one could still see some reference to something. In the late 1800s, Alexander Rodchenko coined the term non-objective art. Here, the object of the art was not to have an object at all. Artists like Wassily Kandinsky explored color theory as it relates to music, logic, emotion, and spirituality. And here we have three different examples of non-representational or non-objective art. We have Piet Mondrian, whose focus is on color and line. We have Malevich, who basically painted a black canvas. This was during the minimalist period. And then Wassily Kandinsky would work with color theory and music and emotion and all of that kind of thing. Now, style is basically the way we categorize art. Just like we group music into genres like rap, hip hop, jazz, rock, country, we group those together because they have similar sounds. Art's also categorized into styles that share similar features. Typically, art is grouped by time periods and culture. So we are going to discuss three different styles of art. We're going to talk about cultural styles, we'll talk about stylistic periods or movements, and then we're going to talk about individual style. So some of the most interesting art that I think are those coming from the ancient Near East. In this kind of the style of art, you have figures that appear very static. You see multiple viewpoints at the same time, and you have a hierarchical proportion as far as figure sizes go. Here we see art produced from about 2600 to 2400 BC in Mesopotamia. Figures of this period show enough detail that we can see the subject of the artwork as human bodies. Here again, like the early Greek sculpture, figures are very static, very stiff. And we can also see in the standard or war panel that the figures use multiple viewpoints at the same time. So you might see a profile but two eyes. So it's a little bit like seeing some of Picasso's Cubist figures. Showing space is also very rudimentary and mostly shown by overlapping figures, but not much else. A hierarchical proportion is used. The greater or more prominent the person, the larger their figures are in relationship to those of lower status. And you find this also as you get into Egyptian art. Now we've got the cultural styles of ancient Greece and Rome. These are basically referred to as a classical style, although that is broken down into some other sub-styles, I guess you could say. We have the Greek high classical, late classical, Hellenistic. Those are all basically Greek. And then the Roman Republic, early imperial, and the late Roman Empire. We won't focus specifically on any of those. We're just going to kind of hit a little bit of that. Some of the best known indicators of previous cultures are the ruins of Greece and Rome. This period is called the classical era. And here's a couple of examples of ancient Greece. The pottery is probably one of the best known remnants of ancient Greece. This is black figure pottery showing mythological figures. They also had a red figured pottery, which again showed the decorations painted on them were stories, and many times it was of mythology. After the high classical era of Greek artwork, statues and sculptures in particular became more expressive. They became more emotional. Art becomes a little more dynamic, more expressive, and a lot of times are exaggerated in some way. Later Greek culture shows political influence as well as influence from foreign countries. Now, Rome sought to imitate Greece, and the early Roman periods actually overlap the late Greek ones. And during this time, Romans favored anti-idealized approaches to portraying people. And this went way past naturalism into an intense study of individuals. Ancestors were highly honored, and people kept their images as portrait heads. They didn't have photographs, so they had portrait heads. And now, with the rise of Augustus to emperor, the practice of idealization came back into play again. And regardless of the actual age of the emperor, his statues always portray a youthful and physically fit Augustus, who was very heroic in stature. During the late Roman Empire period, the naturalistic representations of the human figure became more idealized, more spiritual, and more philosophical. Now we're going to move to the Indian subcontinent. During the reign of Emperor Ashoka, 84,000 stupas, or shrines, were built to house religious artifacts. Trade with the West and the Western cultures brought some of the artistic styles of Greece and Rome to India. While Greece and Rome were the classic civilizations in the East, similar ways of representation do end up and appear in India. In India, most of the statues and sculptures show some influences of Roman Greek while maintaining the Indian idea of the perfect figure, was more robust and more full-bodied than the Greek or the Roman. Now we're going to jump back to Europe to the 11th and the 12th centuries for the Romanesque period. It's also been called the Middle Ages. Romanesque artwork puts the emphasis on Christianity and the end of times. It was very focused on the spiritual, so artwork was more abstracted to indicate spiritual turmoil or spiritual agitation. Architecture is highly decorative, but it's very blocky. You can see here examples of some of the art, a treasure box that is inlaid with gold. And then we have a Romanesque portal of one of the churches, not the Notre Dame, but one of the Notre Dame cathedrals in France. The Gothic era follows with another return to naturalism, focusing on the natural world. Physical facts of figures will now lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. And here the representation of art in Italy begins to go separate ways with the Gothic art of Northern Europe, where the Gothic style actually prevailed until the 16th century. Now we're going to talk about stylistic periods or movements. And there's a great deal of overlap between cultural and stylistic periods. Stylistic groupings tend to focus on similarities in common subject matter, approach, or spiritual or political elements. During this time, humanism was a shared concept that people were inherently good and problems could be solved by reason. We can see some of the things that came about during the Italian Renaissance. It was a very long style period, drew on the classical past, focused on a really big focus on anatomy. Linear perspective was born, religious artwork dominated, and this was the time of the great artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. They are not just Ninja Turtles. The Italian Renaissance was a period of about 1,500 years that led to an amazing artistic and scientific boom. Artists drew on the classical past. There was tremendous focus on the human form. Leonardo da Vinci spent long hours studying the human body, trying to understand the relationships between muscles and tendons and bones. This was also a time where artists wanted to express space in their artwork with a scientific procedure. And so linear perspective is born. Linear perspective allowed the viewer to feel like they were part of the artwork. These are both examples of some of the Italian Renaissance architecture. We have St. Peter's Basilica on the left, and in Florence, the Palazzo Pandolfini. The one on the right was designed by Raphael. The one on the left was by Bramante and Michelangelo. Religious artwork dominated the Italian Renaissance because most of the artwork during this time was commissioned by the church and for the church. Now, this was also a time of uber wealthy families that could afford to have an experienced artist create for them. Artists had very high stature during the Renaissance, and Leonardo da Vinci worked quite a bit for the Medici family in Florence. And obviously, Michelangelo worked a lot in Rome for the Roman Catholic Church. And those are two people that we hear a lot of stories about. So the first two pictures there are the Sistine Chapel and the Last Judgment. The Sistine Chapel was painted in that fresco that we talked about before, where they would put wet plaster and then paint into the wet plaster. And on the right is another fresco, the School of Athens by Raphael. This is a really, really great example of the linear perspective. Now we move on to realism or naturalism. And for the most part, these are interchangeable terms. If you look up both of the definitions, they're almost exactly alike. There's such a fine line between them that we're just going to combine them for this. Now, realism has been prevalent in art at various times. Realism attempts to show the world just as it is, exactly as it is, avoiding any kind of stylization. There was a European and an American movement in realism. So here we have a couple of realism paintings. Gustave Courbet on the left and Jean-François Millet on the right. Now we're going to take a big jump in time to Expressionism. Expressionism chooses to move away from realism, reflecting the needs of artists to express ideas or feelings that can't be expressed in a naturalistic manner. Artists favor the emotional content of the art rather than the subject matter itself. Expressionism is very subjective. It gives each artist their own version or image of what expressionism is, and it can reflect the ideas of the artist only, or it can reflect the ideas of an entire society. Expressionism in Germany in the early 20th century reflected quite a bit of the reactions of society to the political and the cultural unrest at the time. So I'm sure that everybody at one time or another has seen the image on the left. And then the image on the right is Composition 5 by Vasily Kandinsky. Both different types of expressions being conveyed to the viewer. Abstract Expressionism was really the first specifically American movement that achieved global status. Here the focus is exclusively on the medium and the action of using that medium. This style is the one that's most often viewed with the expression, well, I could have done that, but we didn't. Here we have different examples of abstract expressionism. Jackson Pollock, probably one of the best known, putting his canvas on the floor and flinging paint onto it. He actually called that action painting, and that was the whole idea with his artwork, was the action of the painting itself. Then we have an abstracted woman, and we have Mark Rothko, who did color field work. The idea of individual style comes from the fact that some artists have such a distinctive style that their artwork is really easy to recognize. It could be lighting, it could be technique, it could be colors, it could be subject matter. But you look at something, you look at a piece of artwork and you go, oh, I know what artist did that. Now, most of the time you have to study art for a while before you can start seeing individual stylings. Rembrandt and Seurat are only two of the many artists that can be identified by their individual styles. These images are not real great, but Rembrandt, his is very dramatic lighting, mostly portraiture. He is considered to be one of the greatest visual artists in the history of art. And then we have Seurat on the right, who did pointillism. So all this entire painting is made up of probably eraser-sized dots of color. And the idea with that is experimentations with optical color mixing. Your eye and your brain mixes colors. So now we're going to put all this together for our formal or critical analysis. And we're going to narrow our focus here in the second part to just the elements and principles of design. Now, that may sound boring, but it's one of the first steps in decoding an artwork. And the formal analysis has four parts: the description, the analysis, the interpretation, and the evaluation, or the judgment. The description means, very simply, what do you see? Is it two-dimensional, three-dimensional? Can you identify specific things in the artwork? What kind of colors are used? Lines or shapes or perspective? What's the medium used? Some of this information can be gathered from the informational placard that is usually accompanying every piece of artwork. We're going to use The Flower Vendor by Diego Rivera. It was done in 1949. It's in the National Museum in Madrid, Spain. It is an oil on canvas. This is where we said that placard where you get some of your information. So now what do you see when you first look at the artwork? I see a lot of flowers, calla lilies. I see a woman who's handing flowers off to a girl who's sitting on the ground, and she's got a blue kind of cape on. I see a little boy down toward the bottom. He looks like he's wrapping something around those calla lilies to hold them together. And then we have another little girl with a yellow bow in her hair holding some flowers. And we got a guy we've got some people in the very back, almost hidden by the flowers. So the medium we can see is oil on canvas. We see overlapping, it creates space. The relationship between the objects, it's very kind of a tightly woven, almost a circular kind of thing between the woman and the girl in the blue, and then the boy, and then the girl with the yellow bow. It is a two-dimensional artwork, so they use value changes to create the illusion of depth, and there's all that overlapping. Now, here we go to the analysis part. What elements of design are used in the artwork, and where are they used? How are they organized? What is creating unity and variety? What's the scale of the work? What do they use to create emphasis? You can plug in almost every single element or every single principle into an artwork. You just have to know how to do it. So what elements of art are used here? Well, I see color. I see lots of bright color in the clothing. I see the white lilies with the yellow inside part. I see blues and yellows and greens. I see lines that are created by the folds of the fabric. I see what looks like texture, and this would be simulated texture rather than actual texture in the flowers that the little girl on the left-hand side is holding. They look kind of light and airy and kind of fuzzy. We see principles used. We have unity because all of the calla lilies are all the same basic shape, all the same basic color, but then they have the bright green and yellow green stems to them. We have the variety. Not everything is the same color. Not everything is the same shape. The scale of the work, the figures in the painting take up most of the space. There's not a lot of negative space around. And the emphasis to me is the lady in the middle with the calla lilies that's strapped to her. Now, the interpretation comes as much from the viewer as from the artist. What does the artwork mean to the artist? Well, to find that out, we would have to do some research on Diego Rivera and his paintings. He has a lot of paintings of flower vendors. So we would have to find out why he chose that particular subject matter. What does the artwork mean to me as the viewer? And the thing about interpretations is the more you study a piece of artwork, the more your interpretation may change. You might notice new things each time. It's kind of like a movie. When you watch a movie a second or a third time, you tend to see things in that movie that you didn't see the first time. So to me, I find this to be, I find it a happy kind of painting. I really like calla lilies. I find that it is a painting of people who work hard. It has to be difficult working with fresh flowers. You have to pick them, you have to wrap them, you have to get them sold in a good amount of time before they, wilt and die. The interpretation, I see the mom with the calla lilies, and she is asking her children to help her. And that's how I would interpret it. Now, the evaluation or the judgment includes everything that you have learned about the artist and the artwork. Do you think the artist was successful in creating a well-organized artwork? Do you like it? Why or why don't you? So in my opinion, I think the artist was very successful with creating a well-organized artwork. He uses repetition in his colors. The white and the lady in the center, those calla lilies that are kind of arched, kind of draw your eye around, and then it catches the group of lilies that the little girl is taking, and then we see the other calla lilies that the little boy is wrapping. Anytime you have angles in an artwork, it implies motion. I love the colors that they used with it. It's stylized. It isn't exactly realistic. So it's I'd probably either call it idealized or a little to the abstracted side. And I really like the artwork. I really like the theme of it, and I love the colors. And if you come across a piece of artwork that you don't like, that's fine. I just want you to be able to articulate why you don't like it and maybe be able to appreciate the artwork even if it isn't the kind of thing you really enjoy. Whew, that was a long PowerPoint. Here are some key terms, not all of the key terms, and not all of these did we cover in the PowerPoint, so I strongly suggest that you read the book. They are also two very good, detailed analysis in there, kind of toward the beginning of the chapter. I would really suggest that you read through those and kind of place those in the description, the analysis, the interpretation, and the evaluation and judgment. And you can see how a really good one pulls together.